Glenn, and thank you for those very kind words, and I might now prove that I am flappable, actually. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. I'm going to start my presentation this evening by saying a few thank yous. This is so that I don't forget at the end, or I don't do the thank yous when everybody's running out of a bit of time and energy. Lots of people think academic life and research in particular is kind of a lonely endeavour. I can assure you it really isn't. And so I'd just like to thank everybody that I work with, the people who have taken part in my research projects, my wonderful team who even this week have been doing focus groups in parts of Stockport where the taxi drivers told them it was too dangerous to get out of the car, and they're up there looking at climate change issues. And I'd just like to thank all the people I referenced, all the different research groups I work with here and in my past, in my other jobs, so I don't forget at the end. Thank you very much. So, what am I going to cover this evening? I'm going to look at things quite simply. What I want to cover is sustainable lifestyles and behaviours. What are they, and how are they related to urban design? And by urban design, really, I mean planning and urban form. I'm going to look at the evidence around the relationship between urban form and sustainable behaviours or lifestyles. And I'm going to look at how the evidence and understanding the nature of behaviours can be used to help us design more effectively. And I should say right at the beginning, I talk mostly in this talk about behaviours rather than lifestyles. If you look at the literature around this, behaviours really are sort of coalitions, lifestyles are coalitions of behaviours. So most of the literature, most of the theory in this field is around changing behaviour and understanding behaviour. So I'm going to split my talk roughly into 3 parts. So if anyone's got nibbles or anything, they can sort of, they're 3 equal parts, they can sort of process their time through those. So, sustainable lifestyles and behaviours, what are they? Well, first of all, they're very topical. The whole issue of sustainable behaviours, particularly changing behaviours, is a hot potato at the moment for governments, within society, for charities. There are numerous campaigns around changing behaviours for environmental and social good. And here we're thinking of things like campaigns to reduce energy use, to make people travel differently, to encourage more social behaviours as opposed to antisocial behaviours. And there's a big industry around behaviour change. The government in this country, DEFRA, through DEFRA, has set up a centre of expertise on influencing behaviour. Quite interesting choice of language there, influencing behaviour. Looking at a whole range of things, as I say, from energy-saving behaviours to travel to recycling. And DEFRA have come up with a list of headline behaviours, which you can see here circled in the blue, and then they've broken it down into a number of key behaviours, sub-behaviours. There's a huge kind of complexity around this. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. This is just to show you the sort of work that's going on. And things like travelling sustainably are in there, being part of improving the environment are in there. So some of these are related to the physical environment. And if you look at that debate and take it sort of step aside and look at it from a built environment professional's point of view, there's a lot of hype around what our environments are making us, or how our environments are affecting us. And if you believe some hype, some research, some evidence, you will believe that our environments are making us wasteful, energy rich, our homes, the way we travel. Our environments are making us inactive, even obese and depressed. The sort of language of obesogenic environments has come in recently from the government's foresight review on obesity. The way we plan and design is making us inactive and overweight. If you read other reports, look at other parts of the sort of policy landscape, there's a whole field of work that says our environments are making us isolated. They're contributing to depression and the increase in mental illness. They may be unsafe as well, and they may be making people fearful of crime and having a whole sort of family of social impacts, leading to social inequalities, contributing to social injustice. But the corollary of that, and this is where those of us who actually work in the sort of built environment profession sort of situate ourselves, is that if they have the potential to make us all these negative things, they also have the potential, logically, to make us behave in more sustainable ways. And I've just, interestingly, toy manufacturers now are making toy eco-towns, so children can learn from the very start how to understand sustainable behaviours. But if we think about it, if they're making us, they have all these negative effects, they could be having positive effects as well. And if you look at research, policy, design guidance, there are threads of argument through all of that that are saying the way we do urban design, the way we plan, could help us to travel more sustainably, not use the car as much, cycle, walk, use active travel more frequently. Environments could make us healthier, again through activities, but also through reducing the way we plan and design, the way we use the environment. Could reduce air pollution, other sorts of pollution, have effect on our mental well-being. If we design differently, we would use fewer resources. We could have more energy efficient homes and buildings and travel systems and travel infrastructure. We could protect the environment more easily. We could design in ways that meant local stewardship of the environment was more easy for people. Even simple things like how we design our gardens and how people garden within them could encourage biodiversity in neighbourhoods, in urban environments. We could also design differently, and this is very interesting because there's a lot of this in planning policy at the moment. We could design in ways, apparently, to make us more socially engaged, even more democratic, even more likely to take part in democratic processes, to take part in the sort of behaviours that contribute to the development of social capital in neighbourhoods. All of these things are linked in policy and theory with the form and the design of places. And there's also a sort of literature and an understanding around the fact that the way we design could help us support local economies. So if we design mixed use areas, for example, people could start up businesses, money could circulate more within a local economy. And this is just these examples, that these ideas are sort of repeated time and time again in urban design guidance and planning policy. So the logic behind this, and this is just really to situate what I'm talking about, situate my talk today, is that we're interested here in a set of behaviours, sustainable behaviours, that are argued to be supported or enabled by the built environment. So out of all the behavioural change research and interest that are going on, there's a subset of those behaviours that in some way are linked to the physical environment. Now in this diagram you can see I've put sustainable built environments is the big bubble over there. When we're talking about sustainable environments, we're talking about two elements of that. One element is the things that are technically sustainable. So if you build with renewable materials, for example, it doesn't matter how you then use that building, it kind of does, but you know, you've contributed to a sustainable built environment. Things like cycle paths, no intrinsic sustainable value of its own, but if it's used then for more cycling and a shift away from the car, it's a good thing. Likewise, sustainable behaviours, as I said, there's a whole raft of sustainable behaviours. Some are in some way related to the built environment, this middle section. Others have got nothing to do with it. So things like ethical investing, perhaps, where you invest your money, may not have anything to do with the built environment. And yet how you travel, how you heat your home, those sorts of things are situated in that middle area. And that's where I'm focusing my interest today. So I'm not talking about energy efficient design of houses and that sort of thing. I'm talking about this enabling infrastructure. So why does this matter? It matters for a number of reasons. We're facing climate change. We need to look at our energy use, reduce it. We need to think about how we regenerate our towns and cities. Urban areas go through a continual cycle of regeneration. Do we want to build more of the same, or do we want to build places that engender more sustainable ways of living? We have to build more houses. The country needs more houses. I think we're still looking at millions in the next 10 years, even though they probably won't be built the way things are going at the moment. But how do we accommodate that housing growth? Do we want it to be the same as we had before? Do we want sort of single-use urban extensions? Or do we want to think more about how our physical environment links with all these other ambitions? I'm relatively recently onto the scene we've also brought into the planning and urban design realm this whole issue of the health crises around obesity and things like that. Now, all of these things have been on the agenda now for 15, 20 years at least, but I think some of them are growing in prominence, becoming more important, and becoming more explicitly linked with how we build. And I could have chosen any number of statistics or any number of charts to kind of illustrate these points, and I'm sure the audience here today, none of this needs really kind of reiterating, but just to show, this is a diagram again from the DEFRA Lifestyles and Behaviours research, just showing the amount of carbon footprint that's related to fuel use in the home and in private cars, partly in public transport as well. Just looking at obesity trends, long-term decline in active trips. If you just look at these first two columns, walking and cycling, and this is the period 1976 to 2010, seeing the decline in active travel. As I said, I could have shown you many more of that type of diagram, but I don't think that's necessary. So what has the planning and design response been, the urban design response? Well, I think as a sector, we have been incredibly engaged in this debate. I think compared with other sectors, planners, urban designers, architects, built environment professionals have been on this for a long time now. And there's been a plethora of policy, guidance, sustainable design work, research. The National Planning Policy Framework, for example, states very clearly that we should be designing places, providing places. It doesn't state a lot very clearly, but it does state very clearly that we should be designing to encourage the active use of open space, for example. And we should be designing and planning to encourage socially sustainable places where people are actively participating in their communities. It doesn't say anything about how you do that, but we should be doing it. The Sustainable Communities Plan, which obviously came in under the Labour government, was very explicit about what a sustainable community was, how that was delivered physically, what physical forms that required, and how it should be delivered, and what the objectives were in behavioural terms. And more recently, the Foresight review, as I said, looked at obesity, and that's brought the whole idea of designing to reduce obesity much more to the forefront, although again, lots of people have been working on that for years. So what's the planning and urban design response been? Well, interestingly, I think we've had a very specific set of responses. It's resulted in a specific type of urban form that is promoted over and over again. The form is dense, mixed use, permeable, connected, within a regional context. So understanding the regional context, any new development has these sorts of, the idea is it has these qualities. Specific uses are always in master plans now, a mixture of public and private, with very specific sustainable infrastructures, cycle paths, pedestrian routes, car sharing facilities if you're going quite green, sustainable urban drainage systems, these sorts of infrastructure, and specific environmental technologies often around local energy production, sometimes energy efficient home and water and energy systems. And this kind of logic is applying to both new build and regeneration schemes. And we've seen examples of these being developed now in most of the developed world, Asia, the USA, particularly in Europe. We have obviously the eco-towns movement in the UK, Gordon Brown's flagship idea, not all being built, some of them are, a few of them are, but very similar master planning ideas following those kinds of prescriptions that I talked about. There are examples from Germany that display all these sorts of features. This is an urban extension in Kreuzberg, Germany. Developments in Sweden. This is a Millennium Project, BU01, which means Living 01, in Malmö, which has been built exactly to these kinds of principles, high density, mixed use, environmental technologies. So if you live there, you behave in a certain way. And the Millennium Village at Greenwich. In the UK, we had a number of Millennium projects, again, that had these features. Drawings were interesting, no cars in any of them. And this is part of the regenerating cities, doing the right thing, building these sustainable developments. In the Millennium Village, the idea was you would have up-to-date IT to work with your in each flat, and then you would have real-time travel information and this sort of thing, so it links in with technologies. In the States, these aspirations were not as explicitly environmental, but there was very much this idea about creating better places that were more at a human scale and very much in tune with ideas of health and well-being and livability. And then later, as the sort of sustainability movement gathered pace, included environmental aspirations as well. And somewhere that I've visited quite a lot is Celebration in Florida. This is the Disney-owned town that the Disney Corporation have built. It's had a lot of bad publicity, partly because it's Disney and partly unfairly, I think, because a lot of the aspirations at the heart of this development are very sound. It's a new urbanist approach. It's a large-scale development, a brand new development phased over a number of years with high density, mix of use, housing forms that you don't usually see in the States, mixture of tenure, very much concentrating on health and well-being for all generations, from young to older, very much thinking about quality of life, active travel, more cycling infrastructure than you would ever see really in a new build in the States other than these sort of golf course developments. Very high quality landscaping from day one, from the beginning of the project. Mix of uses, the idea being people shop and spend their money locally. Some very big name architects involved, employment facilities, nice scale of master planning, interesting scale of master planning. And there are numerous new urbanist models and developments across the States and other places. Those are kind of new developments. We've also seen this thinking coming out in regeneration schemes as well. These are some lovely images of a refurbishment of an entire suburban district called Augustenberg in Sweden. And Trevor Graham, who provided these as a partner on a project of ours looking at climate change. And this is a social housing suburb that's been developed, redeveloped and regenerated with all of those sort of sustainable objectives in mind, looking at water resource use, walkability, looking at things like the water system, including green roofs, the cycling infrastructure, the scale of development, thinking about how to make it possible to live in a sustainable way. I have this nice example where children have a pet hotel. A lot of children live in flats, so they have a pet hotel on the roof, and children have a timeshare in a rabbit, and they can get it down every now and again, which is a lovely idea. Looking at turning every small piece of land into productive food growing land, so people to learn to garden early on. We can get food from the tiniest sort of scrap of land. Some really interesting aspects to this project, and introducing vertical greenery, thinking about air quality, visuals, all these sorts of things. Very interesting projects. So all that's well and good. It's a big movement. It's a big culture now in planning and design. But there is something quite interesting about it, I think. Well, a couple of things really. Is one, what's the evidence that if you build like this, people actually behave any differently, and do they? And the second thing, which I haven't really put up here, but is, it smacks of very strong environmental or physical determinism. And for those of us who kind of went through, you know, either architectural planning or urban design training, the physical determinism bit was something we were taught to be very cautious of. You know, we don't do, how much do we try to interfere in people's lives and choices by what we build? Didn't the modernists get that wrong? Wasn't it a terrible failure? And yet the kind of physical determinism in the name of sustainability seems to be going on quite unquestioned, which isn't something I'm going to answer at the moment, I think, but just to sort of raise that as a point. So this issue of whether or not if you design like that leads people to behave like this, I think is a very interesting one, and it's something that I've addressed a lot in my research over the years. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time taking you through some of the research that we've done that has addressed this question. The first big pieces of work that I did, going back sort of late 80s, very early 90s, were around the whole issue of compact city and urban intensification. And at the time, the European Commission was putting out a very strong argument. I got a green paper on urban form, a green paper on cities, that was saying all cities in Europe need to become compact, mixed use. This is a sustainable model. We want to stop sprawl and we want compact cities. And national governments, to different degrees, took that on board, and all of our policy prescriptions, whether it was through transport or housing, kind of lined up to deliver urban compactness and urban intensification. And at this time, we did a big 3-year project for the DOE. You don't get 3-year projects from government anymore, but at the time you did have a 3-year project from the DOE, looking at, if you intensify existing urban areas, do you get the benefits? And the benefits they were looking for was, does it stop sprawl and save valuable rural land? That was one of the arguments. Does it regenerate cities and use up brownfield sites, so use up undeveloped sites? Does it actually encourage people to walk and cycle and use public transport more? Because that was one of the arguments. If you make places more dense, you compact them, it's easier to walk, you get more mixed use, it's easier to walk and cycle, public transport is more efficient, and more people will use it. Now, use their cars less. So does that happen? Does it lead to sociable, vibrant neighbourhoods? There's this kind of urban renaissance understanding around this sort of story, this narrative that high-density places lead to more vibrant and social kind of settings, and people behave in a more kind of cultured way. There's this kind of vilification of the suburbs. Suburbs are boring, low-density areas, people don't socialise. It's the city where it's at. And part of this was kind of reinforced by Richard Rogers and the whole urban renaissance movement under the Blair government. So that was a bit after, but was that the case? Were people more sociable and vibrant? And if you intensify, does it actually support local economic development? So we did a lot of work around urban intensification. And the conclusions were, and this slide makes me a little bit sad because this is 10 years research and a PhD on one slide. But anyway, bear with me. There was a bit more to it than this. But does intensification have an effect? It does have an effect, but the effect is good and bad and complex. And one of the complexities, is the fact that people don't really like it. So we did, this research was done by colleagues of ours in a big consortium called Cityform, and they looked at different household types, living in different densities, looked at satisfaction by area. For every household type, they were less satisfied, the higher the density was, and at the same time we're increasing density. So that's one big problem. What we found really was that the planning system and the urban designers and the profession were good at delivering the primary outcomes. So they were good at stopping sprawl. Yeah, we did that. We did save valuable rural land. We did regenerate cities and use up brownfield sites. But none of the behavioural, softer, secondary benefits really were there. You couldn't really find that much evidence for them. So the conclusion really is that urban form alone is not enough. I mean, I think we kind of knew that, but it was interesting because the whole idea of the sustainable city, the compact city, was piled on the urban form. There was very little discussion of what else had to go on to make that work. So planners were charged really with a very big ask: you make cities sustainable, get it right. And we wrote this work up in 3 books. We looked at the compact city, different urban forms, and then we looked at the issues. My colleagues, Mike Jenks and Rob Burgess, looked at these issues in developing countries to see where the similarities or differences were. So that was kind of strategic level research. At this time, this is sort of now the late 90s, going into the 2000s, I suppose. It was interesting that a lot of these kind of master plans were coming out, and this kind of culture, this idea of how you have to design for sustainable places was becoming more prominent. And I was still concerned really that where was the evidence base for a lot of this? So we started a very big, we got funding for it, we started a very big post-occupancy survey of places that have been built to these kind of sustainable principles. And the argument really was that my sort of hypothesis was that we sort of we do the master plan, we build them or we refurbish, we expect these behaviours, we're really excited, and then we're usually a bit disappointed when they don't happen. And this is partly, most of the time we don't even know, actually, because we don't go back and monitor them anyway, so we don't really know. And if we do know, we're a bit disappointed. So we started off this big project. We looked at 13 case studies in the UK. These are all residential or mixed-use developments with a number of these sustainability features. These are kind of flagship schemes, some of them. We looked at the physical features in them. We asked people about their behaviours, and we analysed the relationships between them. This is quite a quantitative study. So these were the with projects, developments were around the country, and we did field work. And these were the behaviours we were looking at: using less energy, less water, recycling, encouraging biodiversity in your garden, for example, or in your neighbourhood. Travel patterns, we were looking to see if people made fewer journeys or if they made them by fuel-efficient modes. Whether they took part in local community groups, whether they undertook these behaviours that are supposed to support the development of social capital, and whether they used local services, amenities and businesses. So we were asking about those behaviours, and we were looking for statistical correlations with a number of physical features related to behaviour under 26 headings, again, of which I won't go into. But there'll be the usual things you would expect: energy efficient heating and water systems, for example, right down, and then the density, the use, live-work units, right down to the range of housing types and sizes. So what we did was we looked at policy and design guidance, behaviours, pulled out all of these features that I argued to be related to behaviours, measured the behaviours and looked for relationships between the two. And these are the sorts of places we looked at. Some of them look very much like you would expect the kind of eco-development aesthetic to look, and others don't. These are all built after 2000, varying quality. But in terms of master plans, they have a number of the sustainable design features. So if you look at the master plan, you can tick them off. So what did we find? Very interesting set of results, and we looked at the results in different ways. So, for example, some of the results, we compared our surveys with national averages, national surveys, and this is slightly flawed, but it's a good comparison. Our study is the SB, the Sustainable Behaviours Project, and what we found was quite interesting. For example, in car ownership, there were more of the households in our study had 2 cars or 1 car than in any other comparable national survey, and we had fewer car-free households, which is probably not what you would have expected. We also found that fewer people walked to work in our developments, very few people cycled, but more used public transport. So that was comparing nationally. We asked people directly on a number of issues whether the physical form had affected their behaviour. So we asked them, for example, why, if you haven't got a car, this was only households with no car, why have you not got a car? Do any of these things matter? The fact that, because you haven't got a garage, so a lot of these developments deliberately hadn't provided garages or parking space. So we asked people, were any of these things important? And very few made real sort of conscious decisions about that. I'll just skip over that one. We looked at, some of our results were contrary to common understandings. For example, we were looking at social interactions. How many people do you know? And the argument is people know more neighbours in high density mixed use. We found the opposite. They know more in low density single use. So there's a number of ways of looking at this information. There's also, what we also did was a huge kind of statistical analysis, so very complex regression analysis, putting in loads of variables, socioeconomic variables, alongside the behaviour variables, alongside the built environment variables. And out of the whole of that analysis, we came to these kind of overall conclusions. For walking, cycling and public transport use, we did find some relationships. They were higher where you had distorted grid layouts. Urban designers know what that means. Where you had a number of uses, mixed uses, where you had a lot of active frontages, so the houses were orientated onto the streets, or there were mixed uses orientated onto the streets. Also where the aesthetics fit with the local character and where there were good pedestrian crossings. For things like encouraging wildlife, we just found there was a correlation with outdoor space. So if you've got outdoor space, private outdoor space, you're more likely to encourage wildlife. Doesn't matter how big it is, whether it's a balcony or a big garden, just having it or not having it makes a difference, which is logical, but we wondered if there was more nuance than that. Reducing energy use. If people knew they lived in an energy efficient home, they behaved more energy efficiently, but lots of people didn't know whether they lived in an energy efficient home or not. Reducing water use. People who lived in detached homes and flats did more water use, they did more behaviours to reduce their water use. Recycling, no significant relationship with any physical features. So if you provide recycling facilities in gardens or homes or in the community, it didn't seem to make any difference, whereas curbside collection made a huge difference. And then there were a few findings around being active in a community group. So at this point, I think we were still very much focused on providing evidence. We wanted the evidence to understand what the relationships were, and we wrote this up, and we had a kind of family of doctoral students doing similar research, these sort of quantitative studies, looking at, for example, quality and social cohesion. Does quality of the built environment relate to social cohesion? Does the design of housing layouts affect privacy? We had colleagues doing design for dementia. How do people with dementia deal with outdoor environments and things like this? So we had a kind of family of these quantitative studies, which I think was adding to our understanding of things. And what we found really from all of this work was that, well, some behaviours happen and some don't. So some are related to the physical environment and some don't seem to be, which, you know, for a researcher, okay, where do you take that? So at this point, I think we got more interested, well, I got more interested anyway, instead of trying to find precise facts, more quantitative work, where does the built environment sit in other explanations of behaviour change? And I was trying to kind of broaden out the explanation. I'm kind of from an urban studies, urban theory background, so I was well aware of kind of urban sociology and cultural geography and all of that kind of understanding of places and behaviours and the relationship of the two. And I was quite interested that that seemed to be lacking in how we were approaching master planning in the sustainability debate. So I was sort of saying, well, okay, there's contextual situational factors, but we know from behavioural psychology that other things are important, motivations, social influences. You know, not everybody can do this stuff, not everybody can cycle. What about habits? People get locked into habits, we know that. So there's all these relationships, and maybe some behaviours are more related to the physical environment, some aren't, I don't know. And we weren't the only people to be thinking like this, obviously. But in trying to understand behaviours, I think this is quite a fundamental thing. And this is, again, I don't expect you to read this. This may be familiar to some of you. This is the systems map that was developed by the Foresight team looking at obesity. And they're trying to map everything that affects obesity. Okay? So the physical environment is in there, but along with meat and the food industry and supermarkets and advertising of food on telly. This is kind of a systems map. You know, policymakers are trying to make policy to change behaviour in this environment. You know, we're kind of struggling here, the obesity focus sort of here, good old DEFRA are here, with, yes, of course, we recognise there are many factors contributing to human behaviour, of which I've just circled infrastructure and geography. Are we over there then? Is that where the environment sits? I'm not sure. So, coming out of that, I think, led me to be far more interested in the assumptions that lie behind, the assumptions about behaviour that lie behind these models. And at this point, we started working with different colleagues in different research centres. This actually happened as I moved to UWE, and looking at other mechanisms of changing behaviour and how they approach changing behaviour, and is there anything we can learn from that? And I think part of the problem really is that going back to this question, looking at the assumptions about behaviour, is that the built environment profession has kind of bought in either implicitly or explicitly, to a kind of individualistic and kind of rational model of how people behave. So this model, which argues really that people have a set of attitudes, and then they kind of have those attitudes lead to intentions to do things, and then they behave in a certain way. And these models were kind of developed in the 60s and 70s, this kind of, and over the years, people have come in and said, well, actually other factors are important as well. This is a partial understanding. You know, norms, social factors, emotions, habits are important. These kind of models have built and built, but the fundamental part of it is that you're talking about individuals and how they make decisions and how they choose which behaviours to do or not do. And a big part of this debate is what they call facilitating conditions. And I think our research has been, our built environment evidence has been feeding into this facilitating conditions. And if you look at the literature design guidance, the language of it is it's very much couched in we design to allow choices, we design to facilitate, to enable people to do things, to enable them to use public transport or to support them or to encourage them. And then we have to know what the right conditions are, but they feed in quite late in the system. And this is being debated quite heavily at the moment. There's a national debate going on between academics, between government, about is this the right model to understand behaviours, and if we're going to try and affect behaviour change, does this work? And into the kind of, to question this has come a big contribution from the social sciences that's saying, hang on a moment, don't look at the individual behaviours, but don't look at the people, don't look at the individuals, but look at the actions. And our colleague Tim Chatterton has written on this very succinctly and very interestingly. If you want to read his report, it's very good. And into the breach has come these kind of socially oriented models of behaviour change, which say don't look at the individual. People are totally constrained by, you know, in how they behave and what they do. We need to understand social practices. And this has been led really by the work of Elizabeth Shove at Lancaster University, and she's been writing about this for years. And her sort of proposition that builds on earlier work really is that social practices, what we've been calling behaviours, but we're now less certain about that, emerge and become normal through the gradual alignment of different elements. And the different elements are both material objects, images, and competencies and procedures. And I'll just explain that because it's not kind of immediately obvious. Materials and objects are sort of physical things that permit activities to be performed in certain ways. So they're things and settings that you need in order to be able to do a behaviour. Skills and competencies, procedures and skills, this is know-how, understanding that lead to activities being undertaken in a certain way. And images are the kind of, and symbolic meanings are the images, concepts associated with activities that determine how and when they take place. And if a couple of sort of, think of a really easy example, drinking cappuccino from Starbucks 20 years ago was not something that everybody did, but everybody does it now. And they particularly do it at certain times of day, and people think it looks quite cool. Not everybody does it, not everybody does it. But how did that come about? How did that come about as a social practice? Well, certain things had to be available. You know, these cups with the cardboard, the coffee houses, that weren't there. It used to be when I was little, it was just wimpy and you could get a milkshake. Now it's completely different. You know, coffee shop on every corner. These things had to come about. It's image laden. I mean, it's like, what is it, nearly £3 or more for a coffee? It's ridiculous. It's image laden, it's cool, you know, to carry that and you look like you're busy and, you know, smart and cosmopolitan or urban or something. There's an image around it which is very different to a plastic cup from the baker's or something. And then there's a sort of range of competencies, procedures, skills. You pick it up on the way to work. You've got to have the money to do it. You've got to know that's where you get it. You know, there's a sort of set of things that have changed relatively recently that have made that social practice become normal. And the other one that really interests me, though I haven't got time to talk about it, is yoga. I kind of, the transition from aerobics to yoga, when we were, 10, 15 years ago, yoga was really just for sort of sweaty hippies, and now it's kind of, but you need your mat, and you need your yoga class, and you need, So you can think of loads of examples of this. And I think the whole concept of looking at the built environment in a social practices model is actually really interesting. I don't know if it's better or worse than the individualistic model. I actually think it's more useful for us. So the starting point then is not that the built environment is the only thing. We get the built environment right, and then we hope that behaviours happen. The starting point is that everything matters, and then we understand where the physical environment fits within that. And we've just started a project very recently, working with colleagues in the Social Marketing Centre here at UE, looking at walking, taking sort of walking as a social practice, and looking at whether or not, if we look at it as a social practice, the urban environment contribution might be more effective. So what we're doing is we're going back to one of the case studies we had in our previous research. We're going back to this new development in Oxford with some walking and cycling infrastructure. And we're taking with us the evidence we have about what supports walking. We kind of know from previous studies that have split it into utility walking and recreational walking. That's how planners think, your utility or your leisure. And there's some consistent evidence we're taking forward, mixed evidence. We've got these findings from our research, that big project we did. We're taking that forward, but we're looking at walking as a social practice. And the first thing, we're doing the research tomorrow. It's very live. We're going up to do the focus groups tomorrow, but already in pilot work, we're finding out that utility and leisure is too crude a distinction. When you talk to people about their walking the dog is very different to walking to work, which is very different to walking with young children in a buggy. So immediately, if you're trying to understand walking and walking environments, maybe we're being too, we're just thinking about it too simplistically. So we're bringing to the table the fact that these core linking infrastructures, these materials, objects you need, we're saying, hey, well, the physical environment, we can tell you something about that. We think you need a good pavement with good lighting, with active frontages, because we know that. You need things to walk to, etc. But we really don't know much about whether you need a dog or whether you need clothes and walking shoes and things like that. We also know something from built environment perspectives around these things, frameworks, legislative policy initiatives. Of course, we don't just build and not talk to anybody. We have loads of people who have brilliant expertise around pedestrianisation policies, things like health walk schemes, these softer ways of encouraging walking, for example. Competencies. We know, for example, we need to know if people think walking is safe. What do they think they need to know? Do they need to know how long walking takes? Do they need maps or something? We don't know. So the red things are things I think we usually we're quite used to working with within built environment. But the other bits I think are way out of our comfort zone, particularly images and symbolic meanings. And again, there's some really good research being done here on this, research on, for example, women and cycling and things like that. We don't know what images people have necessarily of walking. And again, our early research we found that some people found that walking for no reason is really odd. They would consider that odd, to walk out of their house for no reason. To go for a walk would be odd. For other people, it's power walking, so it's fitness and it's purpose. Walking the dog. Lots of people buy a dog for an excuse to not look weird when they're walking, which is fine. Around images, walking is for poorer people. We've had that sort of feedback. It's not what you do once you can afford a car, So we're going into this research saying, yeah, actually, we do know something about this, but these other areas that we're far less, we have far less influence on, and we often don't think about too much. Excuse me. So, if we take this kind of line, if we're thinking about, say, developing a new development, a new urban extension, a new infill, a new housing development, who might we then have to work with to get this right from the start? So what could we do to encourage walking as a normal activity from the start. So again, we're coming in and say, well, we usually work with urban designers, community groups. We do that, we do consultation, we talk to bus operators. When we're master planning, we talk to utility companies. Yeah, and of course we'd work within the legislative frameworks we understand. We talk to local authorities and neighbourhood planning groups. But we'd be far less likely, I think, to talk to some of these other people or organisations that may have a huge impact on whether or not you might walk in a new development. And some of them, quite clearly, are way out of the remit of any new single place. Some of these sort of changes around image might only happen at a national level or at different times. I mean, Elle magazine at the moment is running a walking campaign, and a walking to work campaign that's really interesting, targeting younger women walking with very, trendy images of girls walking to work and things like this. So this is quite interesting. At what point do we, in the master planning stage, need to work with, groups for older people to introduce health walks? Maybe it is we need right from the very start, we need pedestrian maps. None of these things are new. They're going on already. People do these. They do pedestrian maps. They do walking strategies. But maybe we need to understand better how they all link together and how interdependent they are from the beginning of the design process. So, nearly at the end. Does this view, standing back from this, moving away from this sort of individual model, does this more social model of behaviour help us to design better for behaviour change? And I think it does. I think it opens our eyes up in some ways. I think it frames the built environment in a wider set of agencies and disciplines. Again, it's not that we don't do this. We have spatial planning to do this. We have consultation processes. But I think it far more clearly shows that you need all of these things together to make that circle rise up at the same time. The circle is the practice, and you need lots of influences for that to happen. So when we're looking at eco-town development, walking strategies, recycling initiatives, whatever, we need to think about that more holistic picture. I think it signifies a significant role for planning and urban design, actually an absolutely fundamental role for planning and urban design, to get the infrastructure right. Because without the right infrastructure, a lot of the other things won't be able to come to the fore either. And so in many ways, I think what's important is going back to our findings and other research about this sort of physical deterministic nature. I think a lot of planning and design is in a way ahead of its time, in that it has provided the infrastructure, it's provided cycle paths in new developments and things like that. And then we found they're not as used as much as we thought maybe. But maybe this is because we're kind of now waiting for these other things. And maybe we need far more targeted effort around some of the softer interventions now. Now the infrastructure's there to try and encourage the kind of behaviours we want. And I think this approach as well shows how many other elements and agencies are involved. And it indicates the interdependency of them. And as I say, it indicates in some areas planning and urban design may be ahead of the game. I think it also means that we have to collaborate with far more and a far wider set of organisations than we may do at the moment. But it also gives a framework when we're working, for example, with pro-walking charities or energy efficiency charities or other campaigning groups, to see exactly where we fit in this jigsaw. And I think it's very interesting from that perspective. So, is encouraging sustainable lifestyles through urban design a golden opportunity or just wishful thinking? I think really it's wishful thinking if we carry on as we have been. I think if we just kind of plan, master plan, and hope for the best, that's not going to work. I think this kind of, field of dreams sort of model of build it and they will come is not really served us brilliantly. I think this individual choice and semi-rational behaviour model is also problematic. I think it leads us down a street of endlessly trying to find all the variables that you could pick out from the relationship between design and behaviour, and you end up with endless discussions around which socioeconomic groups does that affect more and less, and what other variables have an effect. And we know people are constrained. You know, people have daily lives. Time schedules are critical in their behavioural choices, for example. And so assuming the default position is this rational kind of position is not right, I think, and is not going to help. And the good example here is from our research, I think it's the one of energy efficient homes. As I said, a lot of the developments we looked at had big elements of social housing, and a lot of the social housing, the energy and water efficiency systems were very high-tech, cutting edge. And when we asked people if they lived in an energy or water efficient home, a lot of them said, I don't know. And so people had moved into these developments where there'd been a huge emphasis on getting the technology right, and they had no idea how to use the systems, whether their home was energy efficient or not. Nobody had thought to leave them even a leaflet to let them know about that. And if we carry on with that sort of approach, it's, you know, we won't see the results that we want. So I'm an optimist at heart, and I do believe in physical determinism in respect of anything you build is going to affect something. There's no such thing as a neutral environment. So we might as well be trying to build to bring about societal and environmental good. However, we have to be working very carefully and very closely with residents, with other organisations to make that work sensitively. And so I think now, if you look at behaviours in this way, we have a golden opportunity to understand how behaviours are framed in everyday life, to be much clearer perhaps about what urban design can and can't influence. And I think in a way that's a relief. You know, this is the contribution we can play, but hang on, these other things have to be right as well. And I think urban design and planning are very, very important. I would do, but I think they are. I think it also frees up a way of understanding the importance of timing, this issue of, well, maybe the infrastructure's okay, but now we need some other softer interventions as well. Or maybe the softer interventions are great, but the infrastructure's holding back progress in other areas. Looking at it holistically, I think that's quite useful. I think it also helps us to improve the processes of master planning, processes of consultation, of spatial planning, of partnership working and neighbourhood planning, because we can understand how behaviours sit specifically and exactly what they mean. Elizabeth Shove talks a lot about people don't consume energy for the sake of it, for fun. They consume energy to do what they need to do in a day, to have a shower, to travel to work, to pick up the kids, all these things. And we have to understand those everyday practices if we want to make a real change, and how those are framed and where they're set if we want to actually bring that energy use down. And so I think we also have a golden opportunity to co-create these hard and soft solutions to support the development of sustainable practices. We have this opportunity to understand the place of the physical environment, but also understand how we have to work with these softer measures and these different sorts of interventions to influence behaviours. And I'll just finish there with a photograph of my children. If you don't think that urban design can have an effect, this is how loved up they were after half an hour in celebration, which is designed for happiness and well-being. So they're not normally like this. No, they are really. Thank you very much. Thank you.